This is a video to accompany the poster Modern Architecture, a Direct Expression of Trauma of the World War I Trench. It briefly reviews some of the science that reframes architectural history, and a poster that will be presented at ANFA September 15th through 25th. The question this poster seeks to answer is, how did modern architecture happen? Why did buildings become blank and faceless? So you see the carriage house on the left, a 19th century building, and it has a lot of detail. It looks sort of quite face-like, and it's very different than the blank glass building, the more modern 21st century Queens Library in New York City. And when you do a biometric analysis using 3M's visual attention software, or VAS, you see pretty quickly that people will instantly, implicitly focus on the windows and the door of the carriage house, and they simply don't really look at the library at all. They'll look at the edges and not take in the library. So why did that happen? And so the answer to that question of why modern architecture looks so different than architecture of the past, you really have to look at who the fathers of modern architecture were. Mies van der Rohe, Walter Gropius, both German, Le Corbusier, French-Swiss, and when they lived. So you see they're both born around the same year, mid-1880s, and they die around the same year, 1960s. And when they were in their late 20s or just about 30, World War I happened, and that was a fantastic calamity, then industrialized warfare, mass starvation, a bloodbath of unprecedented proportions with technologies the world had never seen before. And the impact of the war is getting studied more. We recently passed the centenary of World War I, and at that time, actually, this painting that was done by John Singer Sargent, commemorating the American and British troops working together, went on tour in the United States in 2018. What you see here, this is called Gassed. What you see here is a gas attack, and here is a painting that Singer Sargent did of camouflage tanks. These were the first tanks that were ever used in warfare. And it totally was catastrophic in people's lives. And we are now understanding better that one of the World War I outcome was PTSD. More than 20% of soldiers suffered from PTSD. And this is from Jay Winter, professor emeritus at Yale. And it wasn't diagnosed really routinely at the time. And this is just a functional magnetic resonance imaging, which shows what PTSD does to the brain, how it shrinks the brain, and that you actually can see from a brain scan how the trauma will change the brain's internal architecture. So PTSD rewires the brain. During a trauma, your body responds by going into fight or flight mode. And with PTSD, you get stuck there. That's the basic problem. And that to survive, you fragment your relationship with yourself. You become dissociated from yourself because there's just so much pain inside. And what you can see then when you start understanding PTSD and what it does to the brain, you can see that Gropius's PTSD is in his architecture. Gropius served 4 years in the trenches of World War I, and he built this house 20 years later in the suburbs of Boston, and it mirrors a bunker that he would have known, or ones like he would have known on the Western Front. With PTSD, you become disembodied, and so do your buildings. So the Gropius house is on the right, and the one on the left is a traditional New England house, which is directly opposite the driveway to Gropius's house. And one building is much more inviting. You can find the front door much more easily on the older building than the new one. So what you also learn is that one of the reasons that modern architecture becomes so detail-free is that with PTSD, you lose vision, the ability to process visual detail, and so there would be no reason you would put it in. Your brain simply can't take that in. PTSD stops time, and you can see that here where Gropius, believe it or not, recreated the section of a trench in his office 20 miles away from Cambridge, where he worked. And you can see here that just like on a trench, you can't see outside in this office unless you're standing up. Traumatization is stress frozen in place. And so what it does is that feeling so stressed internally made him design this way externally. And Gropius' bedroom is laid out like a dugout. A dugout was where the men slept in the trenches behind a really sturdy doorway where there just would be the beds. And in Gropius's house that he built 20 years later in the United States, you have the same corridor and then a special kind of very sturdy doorway, and there is just beds on the other side of that doorway. With his brain still at the front, two key, seemingly irreconcilable themes subliminally drove Gropius's design process: a need to feel safe and to recreate the trench war experience in an unsuccessful attempt to heal from it. This impact of World War I is discussed in Urban Experience and Design, a new book coming out by Routledge in October of this year, although its publication date officially is 2021. But so now this is an example of how new understanding of what PTSD does to the brain reframes how we explain how modern architecture came about. What about Le Corbusier? He's another founding father. Examples of his buildings are on the right. Le Corbusier has now been diagnosed retrospectively as autistic. The doctors on the lower left here of this slide have all corroborated his autism diagnosis, and it's something that Nicholas Fox Weber, a major biography of his, writes about, mentions in his biography. And so with autism, people often are very smart and think very systematically. They'll make up all these points. They were not going to ask emotional experience questions. They'll just make up kind of very logical points. And you can kind of see the autistic behavior in the way he came up with his 5 points of architecture. And when you do eye tracking, you can understand that how people with autism don't take in stimuli and look at things the same way as people who are not autistic. So a neurotypical person looks directly at the eyes of a cat. This is an eye tracking study that aggregates data of someone looking at a cat and shows that they focused where they focused, putting a large black dot over the place where they focus most. And on the right, you see someone on the autism spectrum, that they're going to avoid looking at the eyes. And this spills over to when they look at a building. So on the left are how people, neurotypical people, look at a carriage house. On the right, someone on the autism spectrum. And again, here's a library. In this case, neurotypical people, we had 30 neurotypical people look at the building and one person on the autism spectrum. The neurotypical people avoided, without their conscious awareness, completely avoided focusing on the blank facade, whereas the person with the autism spectrum focused directly on the blank facade. It's quite interesting to see the difference. And what that helps you understand is Le Corbusier's autism is in his architecture. He was designing for someone who didn't regulate neurotypically. It would be easy for him to focus on the blankness there, rather than a building that had windows that suggested eyes. So just like Le Corbusier's autism, Gropius's PTSD is also in his architecture. So in sum, the 21st century paradigm shift is what we talk about when we talk about new understanding in psychology and biology that make us understand how humans work. How did modern architecture happen? Relationally compromised people with atypical fixations and emotional regulation came up with the approach, abetted by a wounded world that wanted to bury the past, and an economic power structure willing to profit from it. You can read more about this in the Common Edge article, The Mental Disorders That Gave Us Modern Architecture. Impact of World War I. To understand how modern architecture happened, you have to look at the impact of World War I. Architecture became avoidant. It's no longer about relationships, whereas traditional architecture, up until World War I, is always about making face-like facades, so implicitly your brain feels like you're in relationship with the building. The building wants to see you. It's an external expression of atypical internal brain structure. Okay? The 21st century paradigm shift also helps us better understand ourselves. Now that we can use neuroscience to better understand how humans function, we can understand how to build a healthier public realm, and we can also understand why traditional architecture here, buildings all in the greater Boston area, why they all look so face-like and like they're looking to see you.